Hello, I'm Omar Moore, a film critic, among other things. Welcome to my unofficial feature-length audio commentary for the film Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. There's the lovely Columbia logo from the recent past. Everything about this film by Quentin Tarantino is a lie. I'll explain. We have these titles and then this evocation of 1950s American westerns on television. Bounty Law. And we see Leo DiCaprio there playing a character named Jake Cahill for the purposes of the series Bounty Law. And note this format, this kind of, 16 millimeter or television format that was very popular back in the 1950s on American television. And there's the logo. I love the meticulousness and the detail which you will see throughout this movie. Here's the interview. On the left-hand side of this gentleman is Brad Pitt. He plays the stuntman Cliff Booth. On the right-hand side is Leo DiCaprio. He plays a gentleman by the name of Rick Dalton. Rick Dalton does the acting and Cliff Booth does the stunts. Now this is rather interesting because this is done in kind of a mockumentary style. You know, it's supposed to be this documentary or this interview, but it's very much a mockumentary style. And when I keep talking about the idea that everything in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is a lie or is false or is a contradiction or an irony, this is one of those things. Even the titles, the way the film's titles will unfold, and even the way that the logo came up there. Columbia Pictures logo didn't quite look like that. It looked like the colors a little bit more exaggerated. And here's the second phase of titles that you're seeing here now. And you see, this is the title that we're more accustomed to from Quentin Tarantino. His titles look typically like what we're seeing on the screen. The yellow writing, the logo, and you see it there. The kind of the way the graphics on the print of the writing typically looks like that. That's what we're accustomed to. And then we go back to this falsehood. Brad Pitt's on the left of the screen, DiCaprio's on the right, but look at the names. So there's this element again of deception, falsehood, lies. Leo DiCaprio's name is superimposed over Brad Pitt, and Brad Pitt's name is superimposed over Leo DiCaprio. Now we're getting into the movie, the iconography. You've got the shoes and the feet, the foot fetish that Tarantino loves so much. And we're getting now into what looks like the atmosphere of the film. 1969, Los Angeles. Characters now making their presences felt by their introductions. We are now looking at what will be happening, the atmosphere, the players. They're going into Musso and Frank. They are going through LAX. And they're walking in tandem and always from behind here like this. That's where they're shot from. And then we see the car, we see the freeway. We're seeing all these elements of Southern California that people who live there know so well, the freeway. And then, of course, we get to this, the drinks, intercut, Fred Raskin's editing, intercutting these different variables and artifacts. And we see, again, Leo DiCaprio there. And then we see this title, February the 8th, 1969, So then again, this film seems to play as if it's a documentary again. Then we see more artifacts, the Rolls Royce insignia. And then Al Pacino comes in. And Al Pacino plays a movie mogul, a Hollywood studio executive, I guess. His name is Marvin Schwartz. I just love the way that, and they're in Musso and Frank's, which is Musso and Frank is a venerable Los Angeles restaurant, a classic institution. It's anyone who's ever been anyone has, I'm sure, dined in there at least once, and you see all kinds of very famous people in there, and it's just great. Here's a lie, Here's one of the here's another lie, this idea that Rick Dalton drives around. He doesn't. His license was taken from him because he's an alcoholic. So it's Cliff who drives for him everywhere now. I love the interplay between these two men. This film is also about many things. One of them is masculinity and these different levels of masculinity. Some of it benign, but a lot of it toxic. We've got two elements of masculinity here. Pacino's paternalistic Schwartz character, is a man of experience, and he's actually going to play into some of the insecurities of an alcoholic man. Never mind the alcohol, just the idea that as a leading man, Rick Dalton's career now needs to be rethought, needs to be shaped, could be in jeopardy. So Pacino here is using this play, and of course it's interplayed with these toxic masculine things, right? Shooting people, even in a movie context, it's this male dialogue which is done with violence. And even in this moment, this is, for those of you who remember Inglourious Bastards, is a nod to a previous Tarantino film, which of course was Inglourious Bastards, which was done, I believe, in 2009. So you may remember the scene in that movie where the movie theater in France with the Nazis in it, or wherever it was, either in France or in Germany, where all the Nazis was burnt to the ground. And I think it was in France, burnt to the ground with all these Nazis locked in. And so here's kind of a nod to that scene, although this is based on some production that Rick Dalton is in. Anybody order fried sauerkraut? And there you go. He has proceeded to smoke these Nazis. But here's the lie, right? Because, again, there's going to be another lie told here in this movie, because he so adeptly handled that during the scene. But watch here now as he's practicing to lead up to the scene. And he actually is, for the first time or the first few times, practicing with this flamethrower. And he's incompetent. It's too hot. So he struggles with that. And in turn, I think he struggles with his own masculinity, does Rick Dalton. So that's an issue for him. And now we're back to this television western in America from the 1950s. It's looks like a 16 millimeter format, black and white. And he's up against, I guess, one of the more masculine people that you see on screen in one Mr. I've even forgotten his last name for a moment. Michael Madsen is his name, for heaven's sakes. And you see him here, who's been in Reservoir Dogs, and I believe maybe one other Tarantino film in the past. Michael Madsen is a gent. I really am a big fan of his. There's just that certain way about him, and it's unmistakable on the big screen. Again, we see bounty law. It's just funny. Rick Dalton, here he is. And this is all during this conversation that Schwartz and Dalton are having at Musso and Frank. And look where the career is. It's all over the place, isn't it? Now you've got Rick Dalton doing this hullabaloo thing that was popular back then in the late 1950s into the 60s. And, this is the arc of Rick Dalton's career, which is mostly grounded in television at this point. Again, this is all shot inside of Musso and Frank. What you're seeing here now is this a continuation of this discussion. And what Schwartz is doing is, I think, he's trying to help Dalton, but I also think that there is a power play on masculinity here being made by Schwartz. In fact, I think it's a referendum on Dalton's masculinity that I think Schwartz is voting for or appealing to or campaigning to. And this idea that Rick Dalton may be extinct, his career may be dwindling, and Pacino starts to throw in these different masculine figures and plays on the vulnerability. And you can see here, look at DiCaprio there. He's reflecting on this, playing on the vulnerability of the Rick Dalton character. Oh, Bob Conrad wearing his tight pants, kicking your ass. Maybe the man from Uncle will be kicking your ass next, or the girl from Uncle. So now he's introduced a put down of women. This misogynistic put down of a woman in order to make Rick Dalton feel more insecure. The girl from Uncle. And that's this idea that to make a man feel more insecure, you now have to demean women in the service of doing so. As if, a woman is not capable of holding her own. And so what a lot of men, I think, do, particularly in Hollywood, but elsewhere, is they use this word, these vulgar words about women and their body parts. And that's the way to demean a woman in the process of also, from their perspective, trying to hurt a man. It's really misogynistic. There's Musso and Frank, and they're standing outside it there. A great institution since 1919. It's been around a long time. And we see this effect of how Rick Dalton now has really felt those words from Schwartz. And you see Brad Pitt telling him, don't cry in front of the Mexicans. And this is a really interesting thing, because I want you to keep that comment in mind here. Cliff Booth is the, Rick Dalton's minder. But remember, he has just told Rick Dalton Don't cry in front of the Mexicans. That's obviously a racist comment. Then there's this brief thing here about South Vietnam and communists being dead. That's over the voicemail. Then a voiceover. Then you hear Rick Dalton say, "fucking hippie motherfuckers." And then Tarantino's camera, Robert Richardson, cinematographer, cranes up to see the sign that says Cherokee on it. So you see four things going on in a space of about 30 seconds or so. There's been this racist intonation by Cliff Booth. Then there's this issue of hundreds of communists being killed in South Vietnam. Then there's this "fucking hippie motherfuckers" spoken by Rick Dalton. And then there's a pan-up shot to the street sign that says Cherokee, suggesting Native American, and also suggesting the way that Native Americans have been demeaned on that street sign, reducing them to the street sign, but also in Hollywood, in Los Angeles, in the movies. I don't know if Tarantino even designed that to be the case, but sometimes there's really no such thing as a coincidence in filmmaking. Sometimes there are happy accidents. Sometimes there are no such thing as coincidences either. And I just thought that was incredible that came together the way it did. And that's what art does. Links these things like this. And it's just incredible, really, how that happened. We were just introduced to several women who look very different from what you may have seen in Hollywood movies. And if you've seen this movie already, and I hope you have, you will realize that those women are part of the Manson family. Manson meaning Charles Manson. And you know about him. And if you don't, you can do some online research. And there they are again, the same women. And this time, one of them makes a connection with Cliff Booth, and vice versa. He seems to like the woman who is at the back of this group of women. And they're all dressed, it looks as if they've probably not showered for a long time. They just look like they've got the bare clothes on their back, perhaps from Goodwill or something. And then we've got this very famous sign, Cielo Drive. That means a lot to people from 1969 and before. And if you don't know why Cielo Drive means something, you should definitely do some online research. This looks like a repeat of the opening shot of the film, or one of the opening shots of the film. And I love how they reference Screen Gems. Screen Gems is a division of Sony Pictures. Deals mostly with films that involve black filmmakers, quote-unquote urban content. At least some of those films do on Screen Gems. Again, behind the car, I love that shot. And again, here's a masculinity contrast. You've got this insecure Rick Dalton there, and then you've got Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate. And there's a commercial coming from his car talking about the new cologne from men. And so there's this interplay of masculinity going on. You've got the Brad Pitt character, Cliff Booth, being one type of masculine. You've got this more insecure, crumbling guy named Rick Dalton, played by DiCaprio. And then you've got this confident guy, Polanski, who is sitting aside Sharon Tate. Both of and they are married to each other. So that's interesting. That's a contrast there. Then you've got these blossoms or bougainvilleas, I guess they're blossoms, hanging over the apartment, the house of Rick Dalton. And he lives next door to Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski. Now there's another thing, this and Audie Murphy, this introduction of Audie Murphy. Audie Murphy, World War II hero, did some incredible things in the battlefield against the Nazis. By himself, as an American male, held off a troop of Nazis at bay until he could get some more help. I mean, his bravery was extraordinary. While he was wounded, by the way, he did this. And also was a Hollywood star as well, I might add. Audie Murphy. So Audie Murphy was a well-decorated World War II hero as well as a Hollywood star, Hollywood actor. So that reference to Audie Murphy, when Rick Dalton says that, it's not an idle reference. He says that to Cliff Booth. Here's one of my favorite parts of the film, actually. Brad Pitt here driving in his blue Common Gear. That was one of the cars of the moment back in the late 1960s, that little swerve there coming off of Cielo Drive. And here, driving through Hollywood and through LA and the Marquees. I don't know if that's Wilshire Boulevard or another boulevard, but you see Barbara Ling's production design here. It looks so good. The Capitol Records building there, as Brad Pitt's character Cliff Booth is driving through at night with all the songs that you're hearing from the era. I love the music and the soundtrack in general. Quentin Tarantino loves music, and he's got a really good ear for it. And Panorama City, that sign there on the highway, and we're seeing Cliff Booth drive off this exit. And it's just really, the music is terrific. He always knows how to do with the music, does Tarantino, and he places it well, as do others, Spike Lee, Martin Scorsese. They're just amongst the filmmakers who really have a really good ear for music, and they play, those music pieces play important roles in their movies. Here's a nice, great scene here. Van Nuys, The Drive-In, Lady in Cement, Raquel Welch and Frank Sinatra. Watch Robert Richardson's camera float, float, float. And we think we're going to see a movie. And we do see the movie. We hear Keith Mansfield's funky fanfare that has appeared in Tarantino's movies before. And this is The Drive-In, so it looks as if Cliff is going to see a movie. And here's another lie. Why is it a lie? He gets out of his Common Gear. He walks. There's the screen in the distance. He's not walking towards the screen. He looks at it. And then he walks past there's dumbbells there, weights, and goes into a trailer, which is actually his home. So we think he's going to the movies, but he's not. He's going home. And his home isn't this mansion. His home isn't this place like the place that we just saw Rick Dalton in. This is his trailer. This is the stuntman. So maybe he's not getting paid very much money. Maybe we'll talk about some of this. And I love the production design again by Barbara Ling here. Robert Goulet on television. You've got Mannix, the late 1960s series on television. And you've got these iconographies again of masculinity, the beer, women drink beer as well, but it's something that's inherently tied to American men, American males. And here's the Mannix opening titles. You can go on YouTube and look those titles up, and you will see that they're in color when you see them on YouTube, at least the ones I've looked at. And here's Brandy the dog. Brandy. Three in the Attic is a movie, I believe from 1967 or 68, about three women who have been cheated on by this playboy, this playboy, and they exact revenge by having sex with him, hold him hostage in his attic or in their attic, and they all have sex with him. and he comes off the worst for wear. This is not a paradise. Oh, the way that dog food drops in. There's something about that that's very visceral when you see it on the big screen. And then we see again, these earmarks of masculinity, whether they're toxic or not. I'm going to just throw a cigarette into a mix for dog food or whatever that was. And it's just overkill. We're going to just throw all this stuff in. The dog's tail wags. And Brandy's cute, even though Brandy looks like, a pit bull breed. Now, look, pit bulls are not naturally menacing. This is the way they're trained. So people really have to remember that, by the way. Yeah, this is a different kind of man. This is a kind of man, this white male who eats out of the pot he cooks out of. He doesn't put it on plates. He probably doesn't have any plates. So we go from that rough trailer to another kind of really good production design from Barbara Lang, the very clean and pristine house of Rick Dalton. And look, he looks very, very comfortable in his surroundings. His accolades are on the walls and behind him on the shelves, and the gifts that he's got from his movies. He's got this robe on that's probably silk. He's got the big movie posters. Mad Magazine is saluting him. And this is him rehearsing with the audio tapes that you saw a lot of in the 1950s and 60s. So he's doing a rehearsal while in this big pool that's probably as big as Cliff Booth's trailer that he lives in. I just love the way that we see this isolation in the pool there. And look, there's some cars in the top left of your screen. But there's a sense of isolation here as well. I love how Robert Richardson's camera drifts back here, pulls over, and now we see, boom, Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski. And it's, he's wearing this, I just remember this from Austin Powers International Man of Mystery, this 1960s thrilly, flamboyant looking suit. It's classic stuff from back then. It's a different type of masculinity here. This guy is comfortable with himself, Roman Polanski. Now we know of the history of Roman Polanski and what I definitely believe he was doing, which was raping women. Whether they are underage or not, to me, is irrelevant, and it only makes it more heinous, but rape is an act of violence. So there's a certain lie even here. Another lie in this movie. Tarantino's cast Polanski is a very carefree, confident person, and he may well have been. And you hear that music, Hush from Deep Purple. Very interesting stuff. And another aspect of this masculinity. But there's this lie because Tarantino casts Polanski here. But Polanski has done some really, I think, horrible things, heinous things to women. Raping them. There's just, he's been on the run now for a long time. I think he's in Switzerland. At least he was at one point. Here's the Playboy Mansion. And so we go to the Playboy Mansion and we see these three individuals, Steve McQueen, Michelle Phillips, and Jay Sebring. Again, we're looking at masculinity again in a different way. McQueen, this alpha male bullet type, the strong, silent type who gets every woman he wants. And then Jay Sebring, who's quieter, boyish. This is fascinating to me. I'm always fascinated by the way this scene plays out. You've got Margot Robbie there in yellow as Sharon Tate, and she doesn't have very many lines, and that's what a number of people objected to. And I'm mixed on that too. Tarantino has never done women any favors whatsoever in his movies, and I find, quite frankly, his portrayal of women to be very much, highly misogynistic, period. There are some exceptions. Jackie Brown is one of them. But then you think of films like The Hateful Eight and even Kill Bill to an extent as well. But mostly Tarantino does not portray women in a positive light at all. And some of that is true even in this film. But it's much more complicated in certain aspects because he's reflecting a time period where women were completely seen but not heard. And the fact that Sharon Tate is given very few lines in this film kind of goes along with that, although I'm not defending misogyny or defending Tarantino not giving her lines. I'm just saying I understand perhaps the process that he took with it. Steve McQueen here, played by Damian Lewis, who of course is from the UK, from England, and he's explaining to a woman here about this fascinating triangle between Sebring, Polanski, and Tate. What's very interesting is that Steve McQueen is going to talk about this masculinity again. And the woman here is going to point out, hey, Sharon has this particular type of man. It's this kind of 12-year-old boy who is smart, short, that's the kind of man she's attracted to. And what's ironic here is that Steve McQueen, this alpha male who has every woman he wants, says I never stood a chance. It's this wry comedy that comes out of that moment, but also illustrates this contrast in masculinity. And we're going to see that throughout this movie. That line, I never stood a chance, is going to be repeated. And this title here, February 9th, 1969, is going to be repeated if it hasn't already. And again, there's this feeling that you're being built up for a documentary. That subtitle there suggests a documentary is coming, or that this is part of a documentary. This scene is completely unrelated to anything, which I find fascinating, only that Polanski now is in his backyard. Meanwhile, Sharon Tate, who he is married to, is snoring. And then there's a commercial about, I believe it's tanning, a tanning lotion commercial or something like that. Very interesting stuff. You don't normally see women snoring on the big screen, but Tarantino puts it there. And I think it's probably more about this naturalist and innocent manifestation of who Sharon Tate actually was. She really was someone who was innocent and I hate to use this word pure, but someone who was very innocent to Hollywood and had a very short career in Hollywood. And we know why that happened as well. These two guys, I have always felt, form a kind of fight club. I know that sounds a little odd to say. But Brad Pitt, who of course was in Fight Club, I think here, I just think that this relationship is symbiotic between the two of them, Dalton and Booth, and there is a fight club. They're both two men trapped in the same soul. One of them is more daring than the other. And that's what I would say about that. Rick Dalton is someone who is not confident. Cliff Booth is someone who is very confident. And he will go wherever he has to. Rick Dalton has to be led, has to be told. And the only thing that leads him more is alcohol, such as him dunking his head in this ice water to wake up and get that hangover out of his system. Here's Sam Wanamaker, a famous director who did various films, westerns, TV series, whatever. And one of the things that Once Upon a Time in Hollywood celebrates is the movie making process and all angles of it, not just from the director's point of view or the movie mogul studio head's point of view, but also from the filmgoer's point of view. So, Tarantino loves cinema. He loves cinema. And so what you're getting here is a cinephile in Tarantino and a movie lover and a movie fan in Tarantino all at the same time, covering all of the bases about the movies, about the process of making them, about the planning stages, about the pre-production, the post-production, the production itself. You're going to see all of that during this film. Pretty much all of it. Some of the post-production, not necessarily, but you're going to see all the other aspects of movie making. I think one of the things that's very true, I've talked about this film being a film of fantasy and lies. One of the things that's very true is the vanity of actors and the self-consciousness of actors, and actors being their own toughest critics. And you're seeing it here with Rick Dalton. He's worried about his hair. He's worried about not being seen. This is something that is very true about actors, I think, to a large degree. There are exceptions, but I think actors, like a lot of us, are very vain. We're insecure. And we want to be, if we're on the big screen as actors, we want to be seen. Combat, back to back, this framing of violence. That's another thing this film is about. The way that violence is portrayed, displayed, covered, not covered, as we're going to see. It's fascinating. Again, this behind the back, through the back of the car shot that is common throughout this movie. Brad Pitt here. I think Brad Pitt has never been better in a film. This guy is really acting here, and that's no disrespect to Brad Pitt. This guy acts his ass off in this movie. And look, this is an Oscar-winning performance. Supporting performance. It's just great. Pitt really is able to show us these different layers of Cliff Booth. Not just physically, as you're going to see here in a few moments, but also from the heart. I love the champion shirt. That was very popular in the 60s, if not before then. And the Hawaiian shirt that he's got on as well. And it's not, it's this golden yellow Hawaiian shirt. And again, these tools, look at him jumping here, and that's a stuntman doing the work. But that's a really, maybe it's not. I think it probably is, though. That's a really good level of his physicality that you're getting to see. And watch him effortlessly here take off his shirt and show you his body. And yes, I know there are men and women who swoon at that sight of Pitt taking his shirt off and showing you what he's got. If you got it, flaunt it. But there's also a reason not just that the sun is out and he's taking his shirt off to show you what he's got, but also this is a manifestation of his character as well. Contrasted with Paul Revere and the Raiders, the album cover you just saw there, Spirit of 67. Paul Revere and the Raiders, they're very boyish. They are a very boyish group, or they were. Did some really good songs. And in the 1960s, they're a really good group. You see, this is Cliff Booth now thinking back to a part of his career as a stuntman. Look, he's really thinking back, and we're going to in a moment see this, right? This is where this comes from. He's thinking back to a recent moment in his career. He's got the cigarette, and here comes another man with a cigarette. Hey, it's Kurt Russell, who's also been in Tarantino movies before, including Death Proof, I guess, or Death Trap. I think it's Death Proof. One of the Grindhouse movies that Tarantino did. Now, this is the trailer for Rick Dalton, but that trailer looks exactly or fairly close to the interior of the one that Brad Pitt's character, Cliff Booth, actually lives in. Kurt Russell plays Randy here. He actually will also do some narration later on in the movie. And he is talking to Rick Dalton here about Cliff Booth. And there's this revelation that's going to come out about Cliff Booth. That Cliff Booth is, hey, this guy is not fit for purpose. This guy brings a very dangerous vibe to any film set. As a matter of fact, so much so, you shouldn't even have Cliff Booth as your stuntman, because Clint Booth killed his wife. Cliff Booth killed his spouse and got away with it. That's what Randy's going to say here to Rick Dalton. And furthermore, he also says that, Randy says that his own wife, his own spouse, her name is Janet, played by Zoe Bell, the great stunt woman and actor, that she also doesn't approve of having this toxic and murdering guy on their film set. And so here's this flashback of Cliff, and obviously this, I guess, is his spouse. And again, this is the thing about Tarantino, he portrays women in a particular way as these nagging figures, and Cliff doesn't say anything here, but then look at this close-up of her ass, right? Bulging out of her bikini. I mean, there you go. You want to talk about a misogynistic moment. And there's other shots that are similar where you see these close-ups of women's asses, including Sharon Tate's. There's the lie, right? Because Kurt Russell has just said to Cliff Booth, to Rick Dalton, hey, look, you know what? This guy shouldn't be on the set. And then he goes over to Brad Pitt and says, hey, come on the set. So there are these lies being told constantly, these contradictions, right? That are, as I say, constantly going on throughout this movie, which is a fantasy in great respect. But Randy there, who's played by Kurt Russell, does tell Cliff Booth, but my wife doesn't really want you anywhere near her. Stay away from her. Here's Bruce Lee, and he's played by Mike Moe. This scene here, to me, establishes two things. One, again, this idea of masculinity, and how this short guy has this masculinity, but he's also invoking black men as well. As an Asian man, he's invoking other men of color, black men, boxers, Sonny Liston, Cassius Clay, Joe Louis, who of course were champions in boxing, heavyweight champions of the world in boxing. And you've got this white man who's actually killed a human being sitting there listening to all of this in Cliff Booth. And he's considering what he's saying. And he's scoffing at the notion that this short Asian guy, named Bruce Lee no less, could do any damage to Cassius Clay. And he's going to let Bruce Lee know this. And he's already demeaned him, right? Oh, you're kind of pretty for a stuntman. Actually, this is actually demeaning by Bruce Lee. This idea of Brad Pitt / Cliff Booth being the pretty boy, so to speak. But Brad Pitt has actually shed that image, and I think that image was around there for a bit with Pitt, with Meet Joe Black and movies like that. And I think after Legend of the Fall, I think that kind of changed for Pitt, and he became a bit different from that, and I think this is Pitt's best performance on film. But again, here's the masculinity lingo, right? You've got one guy sitting there and he's telling Bruce Lee, so you dancers never have to get into a real fight. So now he's, again, dancer, right? So now you're saying a dancer's not quite masculine, or there's something that may be feminine about that person. So there's, again, this misogyny bent that kind of hovers underneath those comments that are spoken so casually. And that's what hurts our society. These things are so casual, so subtle, but also so blatant, and that's what's toxic about them. In the casual language that we speak on an everyday level, as men and as women, or as people who do not associate with either gender, male or female, we all speak in this way. And sometimes it's so subconscious and unconscious. Bruce is being told that the guy he's about to fight actually did kill a woman, his own spouse. And you're going to hear this exaggerated, which I think is racist. Bruce Lee didn't do that. That's something that I think is put in for, quite frankly, for the amusement of white audiences. Because you hear, every time I've seen this movie in a theater, and I've seen it in a predominantly white movie theater with white audiences, I've always heard a lot of laughter. But usually in a mixed audience, or in an audience that's perhaps a bit more black and more Latino, I don't hear that laughter as much. Bruce Lee has just been thrown into a car after he has decked Cliff Booth, and now they're on for round 3. And you can see that Booth is holding his own against Bruce Lee. And here comes Zoe Bell, the Australian Zoe Bell, who is terrific. She's been in movies for a long time. She's been a stunt woman and stunt coordinator for many years as well. Good actor. And look at the way her own spouse, her husband, calls her babe in front of them. I love how this scene plays out, because it's an example of this toxic masculinity. You've got a woman here who will be incandescent with rage in a moment. "What the fuck did you do to my car?" she says. And she reads Cliff the Riot Act. Get your wardrobe, get your shit, get off the lot, get fucked. And now here's Randy saying, "I'm going to handle it. And he says exactly the same thing, but he doesn't use any curse words. Get your wardrobe, get your things, and get off the lot. So there's this commandeering of a woman's authority. And Randy tramples all over Janet, his own spouse, tramples all over her. I'll handle this. And it's this really fake kind of thing, but he's trampling on the woman he loves in front of these men to show some male authority at the expense of his own spouse, of the woman that he loves. And we've just seen Charles Manson here. And here's another masculinity test. Are you afraid? I'll tell Jim Morrison you were dancing to Paul Revere and the Raiders. That's what Sharon Tate is telling Jay Sebring. Jim Morrison, another type of masculine figure who, is talking about wanting to have sex with every woman he can. Paul Revere and the Raiders, this kind of clean-cut choir boy type. And the fact that Jay Sebring would even be dancing to that would, I guess, be embarrassing to him. So I think that's where Sharon Tate was going. And look here, this is Charles Manson, the only time we see him in this movie. This is a fantasy because this never happened. To the best of my memory and knowledge, Charles Manson never ever walked up to that house, never ever had this confrontation or at least exchange with Jay Sebring or Sharon Tate. This is an entire fiction. What's interesting is that the Paul Revere and the Raiders song plays over that. And I think the song is called Hungry. And it's so interesting, that song, because it's a much more masculine themed song. And that's the one that is picked by Tarantino. And he handpicks all the music that plays over that moment that Manson leaves the area, the residence, or the area where Polanski and Tate live there on Cielo Drive. Again, we see the movies here now. We transition back. The movie set. We're on another movie set. This is Sam Wanamaker's movie set for, I guess it's a TV Western or a TV film or something called Lancer. And I love how we get to really enjoy Barbara Ling's production design. And then we see these feet again. This is a constant Tarantino fetish. This time, the boots of what looks like a female. In fact, we now see that it is a female. And this particular female looks very young. She is, and then we see this shot of, the Rick Dalton character. And to see part of his crotch, his hips. We see these movie sets. And we see the distance between them. And I love the establishment of this distance because it's important, this distance here between them. And it's shot from the perspectives of both characters with these two cameras. I'll try not to bother you. There's so much going on even in that dialogue and even in this juxtaposition, I think. This scene means a lot. It's going to run for about maybe 5 minutes. On one side, you've got innocence and precociousness in this young girl who's played by Julia Butters. She's going to say that she's 8 years old. And on the other side, you've got this guy who's gone through the meat grinder, who is an alcoholic, who is very insecure, who is an adult. He's experienced a lot of ups and downs. And he's a wreck. He's an absolute wreck. And you wonder if this 8-year-old girl is going to become Rick Dalton in 15 years or so. In fact, there's a line later on in the scene where Rick Dalton does say in 15 years you'll be living it. And there is a That line has a lot of different connotations to it. What I also see here, as I alluded to earlier, is this precociousness on behalf of this 8-year-old girl. I envision her as a Jodie Foster or a Dakota Fanning, who actually you will see later on in this movie, or as an Anna Paquin, or a Quen Vene. I've forgotten how to pronounce her name. Quivenjane Wallace, who was in Beasts of the Southern Wild. I think she was only 9 years old when she was nominated for a Best Actress Oscar for that film, Beasts of the Southern Wild. In other words, these very smart girls who are, 8, 9, 10 years old. I think of Tatum O'Neal and Paper Moon. I mean, so that's the angle I'm coming from when I see this 8-year-old. But I'm also seeing this potential predatory relationship, this predatorship on behalf of DiCaprio's character, Rick Dalton, who actually here is not even Rick Dalton. He is actually in character more or less as Jacob DeCoteau. And there's this discussion between the two of them about how to pronounce the character's name on this show, Lancer. So I'm thinking of Roman Polanski now, all of a sudden. I'm thinking of Harvey Weinstein. I'm thinking of, name any one of a million Hollywood / news, TV news, media, power brokers, Roger Ailes, Charlie Rose, Mark Halperin, Les Moonves, right? You can run down a list of any one of these millions of Matt Lauer. There's always that, so I'm thinking about that as well. There's this, I'm thinking of people like Kevin Spacey, and Brett Ratner. And all these other directors and people and actors who have either been accused of or been found guilty of doing all these horrible things. I believe all the women in these cases, by the way. Jacob DeCoteau is talking about this novel that he's reading, but he's really talking about himself as Rick Dalton. More of his days in pain than ever before. And I don't think, quite frankly, I think this is a lie here, because I don't think that Jacob has even read this novel. I don't think Rick Dalton's really read this novel at all. I think this is just an act. And if it's not an act, well, look, he's stuttering. He's not the best anymore. Easy breezy. I guess this is a character in this novel. And, he hasn't read this book. I think that's a big lie. I think he's telling this 8-year-old a lie. And he's really thinking about himself. He's really talking about himself as Rick Dalton here. That's my belief. Slightly more useless each day. Yeah, and you can see he's internalizing this. There's the layering in DiCaprio's performance here, because he's playing at least 3 or 4 different characters. But he's Rick Dalton playing Caleb DeCoteau, excuse me. It sounds like a really sad book. This is what Julia Butters is telling him. But it's a sad life. It's really, look, about 15 years from now, you'll be living it. And that line gets lost, but it's actually kind of, I think, cringeworthy. And then he proceeds to demean her by calling her pumpkin puss. So there's, again, is the kind of misogynistic put down here. And I love how she stands up to him, though. As an 8-year-old, she has that awareness and confidence to say, look, I don't like that term. Don't call me pumpkin puss. But I'll deal with that later. I'll take mercy on your pitiful ass now. But I'll take that up with you later. And I love the dissolved cut there by Fred Raskin. And we see a different level of innocence now. Sharon Tate. I think this is Margot Robbie looking most like Sharon Tate than she does at any other point in this film, because it's obvious that she doesn't look like Sharon Tate in the rest of the movie, but she really does here. I think this moment here, and I think this is Buffy St. Clair song, the circle game that you're hearing as she's driving through Beverly Hills on Wilshire Boulevard. I drive this stretch of road from time to time when I'm down in Los Angeles, and I love that area of Wilshire Boulevard there in the Beverly Hills. This is a moment of innocence here. You know, the moment where you could just pick up a hitchhiker, no matter what, and no matter who he or she was, you just pick them up. And this is in 1969. And this is another part of this movie. And you see the movie poster for Joanna, which was a film back in 67 or 68 that dealt with a woman in London who goes through the mod era and becomes a different kind of person, different kind of woman. There's this insularity, and there the foot fetish. We see the boots, the legs, the boots, and we're going to see so many other shots of legs and boots and feet throughout this movie. That's what Tarantino apparently likes a lot of. But there's this insularity because, of course, in 1969, lots is going on in America. There's this social turmoil. We've had assassinations of 2 people within the previous year. In 1968, MLK, Martin Luther King Jr., assassinated in April of that year, 1968. And then 2 months later, June of 68, in Los Angeles, for goodness sakes, RFK assassinated. And you wouldn't know any of that stuff has happened. The Vietnam War is raging. Well, we did hear some audio about that earlier. But you would have thought that stuff was completely non-existent for the most part, because again, it's this insularity of Hollywood, this bubble. And I think Tarantino does a really good job of hermetically sealing that bubble. These folks are disconnected from the realities of the world outside their window, outside of Hollywood. I mean, there are references to hippies and fucking hippies, as Rick Dalton would say. But they don't talk about politics. They don't talk about anything else. They're really just literally talking about the work they do, the food that they're going to eat, the music that they listen to. That's really going to be what their atmosphere is. Here's the cut, and you notice that Timothy Olyphant in the red shirt there didn't have his hat on, now has it on. And I think that's deliberate. People might say, well, there's a continuity issue. But I think that's a deliberate thing, because he begins with not having his hat on, then he has it on in these jump cuts. And Tarantino is known for sometimes doing these very quirky things in his movies. And it's done not as a mistake, but deliberately, as a little playful device. And then you see, again, he doesn't have his hat on again there. Do you notice that, Timothy Olyphant? And I do not think that's a continuity mistake. I actually think that is a deliberate thing that Tarantino wanted from Fred Raskin. Because there's an element of fantasy to this. Because you see DiCaprio here reminiscing about how he lost out to Steve McQueen for playing the role in The Great Escape. And then you see this fantasy of DiCaprio's character, Rick Dalton, as if he is Steve McQueen there being spliced into The Great Escape. And he's talking about George Peppard, who we've seen on the marquee in a previous scene there in the film Pendulum, where Sharon Tate is walking through Westwood, the Westwood area, I guess. And so this is DiCaprio reminiscing that he auditioned for this role that Steve McQueen is now playing. And it's very interesting because, of course, as I said earlier, Steve McQueen said that he never had a chance when he was dealing with these 2 12-year-old boy type figures in Sebring and Polanski. And now you're going to see DiCaprio's character, or hear his character say, I never had a chance up against Steve McQueen. It's a perfect kind of doubling of this dialogue that happens, and there's doubling elsewhere in this movie. Again, the shot of the feet and the legs, those boots, the costumes pristine. This is another element of the movie making infatuation, the movie fandom now. So much of this kind of navel gazing and self-reverence and self-absorption. But for Sharon Tate, I don't think it's so much that, it's just the gaiety of wanting to see herself on the big screen. It's an innocent, honest moment. It might be the most honest moment of the film, where Sharon Tate literally wants to just go and see herself in the movies. That's just the most ordinary thing. And it may be vanity, but it may just be this appreciation of a fan of the movies, including the movies that she herself is in. And you hear of actors who say that they don't like to watch themselves in movies. Once they've done their acting, that's it. They won't go back and look at it. This is not that kind of actor. Sharon Tate was not that kind of actor. Obviously here, or at least in this moment, I don't know if she ever did go in and see herself on the big screen. I don't know if that really even happened, to be quite frank. But I think this scene is shown for two reasons. To show you the innocence and everydayness of Sharon Tate, and also to show you movie fandom and kind of connect with the audience. You know, we could all identify with wanting to go and see a movie, and probably wanting to go and get in for free as well. I love this. The cameras back then, no cell phones obviously in 1969. And I love the fact that it's taken right next to the poster where the real Sharon Tate, of course, figured in The Wrecking Crew, Dean Martin's films. You know, he played Matt Helm in that film series, and there was like 4 or 5 movies done with him playing Matt Helm, and those movies ran from the mid-60s, I think, into the early 1970s. And there's that shot of Sharon Tate's ass. Now we're seeing this more toxic, violent masculinity, right? Joe Namath, Broadway Joe, right? The New York Jets quarterback, the famed quarterback that predicted a Super Bowl win. And indeed, the New York Jets upset the Baltimore Colts 16-7. I think that was in 1967 or so, whenever that was. And Joe Namath was a star in Hollywood for a time. CC and Company. These are kind of these B movies. And Margaret was also in the movie. You saw her name on that trailer that was being shown there. So these B movies were, and you can actually see this trailer on YouTube for that film CC and Company, and it is exactly as you see it there. And I love how Margot Robbie is enjoying all of this as Sharon Tate, and now she's going to watch herself, or rather she's going to watch actual moments from The Wrecking Crew, the real movie. With the real life Sharon Tate there, she falls over. Somewhat surreal to see that, because a lot of movies normally put in the actor playing Sharon Tate. But Tarantino decided, nah, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go with the gusto here. And I'm actually going to create this reality and fantasy. The reality is the movie that you're seeing there, and the fantasy is that an actor playing Sharon Tate would watch the real Sharon Tate on the big screen. I think it's a lovely moment. I know people do complain about Sharon Tate not being dialogue and getting a lot of dialogue, and I am deeply conflicted on it too. Notice the feet and the dirtiness of her feet too. You'll notice that because there'll be a scene later with one of the hippie women who belong to the Manson family she puts her dirty feet just like that, crossed over like that, onto the windscreen of Cliff Booth's car when she is picked up by Cliff Booth. You'll see that later on. This doubling is a doubling effect, this doubling that continues throughout the movie. I love this because this is from Lancer, and you see the close up of the gun, and in the distance is Johnny Madrid, played by Timothy Oliphant. And you think that the guy with the gun close up to you is going to be the winner of this thing because he's already got his gun unholstered. And it's unholstered and he's got it ready to go. I mean, we'll see that the lie comes again because Johnny Madrid will end up dispensing of the guy who appears to have the jump on him in this scene from Lancer. You can tell that Tarantino loves Westerns. He did some of that in Django Unchained. He did some of that, a little bit of that, I think in maybe Kill Bill Volume 2. Sense of this kind of Western type journey. Certainly did it in The Hateful Eight. And he's doing it again here. And he salutes Westerns from all areas, whether it's Sergio Leone, Sergio Corbucci, or whomever, Sam Wanamaker. I love how DiCaprio just tosses that chicken drumstick like that. Now look, this guy has already had his holster unholstered, opened. So he appears to have the jump on Johnny Madrid here. But we're going to see in a few moments he doesn't have the jump on Johnny Madrid. And down he goes. Now that's interesting because Caleb, the DiCaprio character, is talking to the guy that got killed, who's going to get killed, as if he knows him well. And usually it's the reverse. Usually you don't have that scene in a Western, at least I don't remember seeing it, where the guy is talking to someone who's going to end up being killed like that. And he's so familiar with him, you'd think that it would be the guy who is not familiar with who's going to end up being killed, but it didn't happen that way here. They are talking about old times as characters in this film, not as actors. The production phase of Lancer is well and truly underway, and I love the smoke that goes through the light, refractions of light there. Thanks to Robert Richardson's camera work, his cinematography, it's just great. He also shot, among many other movies, he shot several other Tarantino movies. He's also did the cinematography for Oliver Stone's Natural Born Killers, which Quentin Tarantino wrote. That's right, Tarantino wrote the script for that, and then I think Oliver Stone jumped on board with another writer. I think Hank Corwin edited Natural Born Killers. But Oliver Stone jumped on and added to that script as well, and then made the film, himself directed that film. I think Tarantino was on course to direct Natural Born Killers, which ended up coming out, if I'm not mistaken, in 1994, which is the same year, if I remember correctly, that Pulp Fiction came out in. So I thought that was rather interesting. So this scene is a good one because we're going to see the characters here. Everything looks really good. Everything's going to plan on this production. It all looks so well orchestrated. And we're now going to see the breakdown, the lie. Now DiCaprio's character, Caleb de Coutu, has forgotten his lines. So now we snap out of this made-for-TV fantasy to go to the reality, is that Rick Dalton has forgotten his lines as Caleb de Coutu. And this is part of the movie making process that goes on, where we do see this, where takes get burned. Actors will burn takes, sometimes deliberately, sometimes not, at the behest of the director sometimes, and sometimes not. And I love how Timothy Oliphant reacts to all of this. And the camera swivels around the A-B convention, how the camera swivels around here. And we're going to see DiCaprio forget his line again. And he's now going to have a full-blown meltdown on the set. And watch Oliphant here in the close screen. His eyes. Watch him. Watch Timothy Oliphant here closely. The next few moments here. And we're going to see him again. Look. It's like... And we're going to see him again, close up again. Watch this here. Oh, it's these subtle little things that you see. And then we see this camera again. That's Tarantino's camera. Not Wanamaker's, but it's really Wanamaker's and Tarantino's. It's just really great. We see the breakdown in this process. But it's a degree of not necessarily breaking down the fourth wall, but illustrating to us, looking in through that fourth wall, that everything isn't okay. And we really get to see that everything isn't okay right here, as we see these jump cuts coming from Fred Raskin on a very agitated and angry Rick Dalton. In his trailer, again, the trailer looks just like the interior of the trailer for Brad Pitt's Cliff Booth character. It's kind of, again, these like two sides of the same soul, these kindred spirits in a way. But they couldn't be more different. This is really fine acting from DiCaprio here. He's just screaming. It's more the alcoholic talking, but he's having this blazing confessional. And there's a funny moment in it. He's promising to stop drinking. Then he drinks. Oh, DiCaprio. And I've had some criticisms of DiCaprio, but I respect the guy because I actually think he is a good actor. I didn't always think that about him, as he promises to blow his own brains out here as Rick Dalton. And he's talking in the mirror and he's looking at us. But DiCaprio has earned my respect. He has done some good work. The Basketball Diaries, among them. The Wolf of Wall Street, What's Eating Gilbert Grape, This Boy's Life, some of those earlier in his career that I mentioned, some of them more recent. And here, I think he does a really good job here as well. Some of his most layered work, I think, is in this movie. Here again is the wrecking crew, the real life Sharon Tate on the big screen, along with Nancy Kwan, I might add, from that movie. There's Nancy. And then you've got the movie Sharon Tate watching her. So there's these degrees of fantasy and reality blended. And you see, that's the real Sharon Tate. That's the fake Sharon Tate. You have Bruce Lee. And I think that's Mike Moe's Bruce Lee right there. And there is Margot Robbie as Sharon Tate there. It's really good how that's blended, because that was not the real Sharon Tate being taught by Bruce Lee. That was Margot Robbie as Sharon Tate being taught by Mike Moe as Bruce Lee. Now, in real life, that did happen. Bruce Lee did actually choreograph Sharon Tate for those scenes. Bruce Lee, by the way, was born in San Francisco, in Chinatown. I didn't know that until very recently. We all know what happened to his son, Brandon, very sadly, on a movie set, no less, for The Crow Part 2, I believe it was. Or was it on The Crow? I forget which. But he was killed. A prop gun actually was loaded. It did not have blanks in it as it was supposed to, and he was killed. It was so horrible. That happened, I think, in the 1990s. It was so horrible when that happened. So horrible. Cliff Booth makes a return, and he reminds me of Robert Redford here. And remember, Brad Pitt and Robert Redford were in a film together called Spy Game. I think it was Tony Scott, the late Tony Scott, who directed that. And you hear the music here by Neil Diamond, Brother Love's Traveling Salvation Show, a great tune that we often don't think of when we think about Neil Diamond. You usually think of Sweet Caroline. But I love this tune and how it plays throughout. You know, this vitriol being leveled at the cops. Fucking pigs. You know, there's fucking hippies and fucking pigs. And you now finally see here this very confident man and this very, I think, eager woman who has been trying to get Cliff to pick her up and take her somewhere. Chatsworth is the place, and we'll find out that Chatsworth, of course, is the location where the Spawn Movie Ranch is, and we know about the Spawn Movie Ranch. Chatsworth is in the northwestern part of the greater Los Angeles area, right by the San Bernardino Mountains. Brad Pitt really does look like Robert Redford here. Right there. He looks just like Robert Redford when Redford was in his heyday in the 60s and into the 70s. I mean, really, he looks like Redford there. Just the body language, the smile, the relaxed posture, and the body language looks very much like Robert Redford. And even the hair tone, you know, the hair color, it looks just, I mean, it's amazing. You know, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, you know, which some people have likened parts of this movie to, you know, the buddy aspect of it between DiCaprio and Pitt. But there's a confessional going on here for Cliff Booth, you know. He talks about himself a bit here. And there's the doubling, right? The feet on the windscreen that I was telling you about. Sharon Tate had her feet up, and now we see this particular one with her feet. They look rather dirty as well, being stuck up on the windshield of Cliff's car. Cliff doesn't seem to mind that. It actually isn't Cliff's car, which is another lie, right? Actors are phony. That's kind of true. At least what they do is very phony, although it's real, but it's a sales job. So, you know, this car isn't even Cliff's car. So there's a lie there that's going on. It's actually Rick Dalton's car, but of course Rick Dalton can't drive it. So this is the daytime. We saw Cliff riding at night in his own common gear. Now we've got Cliff during the day riding in a better car, a nicer car that isn't even his own. And now this young woman now wants to have oral sex with Cliff Booth and go down on him. And Cliff says, you know what? How old are you? And she's been found out because she's not really 18. And because Cliff is a smart guy, he wants to see ID. I mean, even if she were 18, doing that on a freeway could, if the police ever saw, could put them in trouble anyway. So even if she was the age of consent and she gave her consent, you know, doing that on a freeway would have them in trouble anyhow. So that's another lie that's kind of buried deep between. Here's the truth, though. What I'm too old to do is go to jail for poontang. And it's kind of this vulgarism about a woman. But Cliff, in his way here, is looking out for himself and looking out for this clearly 16-year-old, as she admits, I think. That she is, you know, underage. And it's so interesting. It's kind of a contradiction because Cliff has killed a woman who was his spouse. And yet he is asking a 16-year-old for ID that shows that she's 18. He wants to have proof. But obviously that is such a wild contradiction because this is a guy that's murdered a woman who happens to be his spouse. So there's this constant irony, fantasy, and lying that goes on throughout Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. It's fascinating to me how Tarantino, who wrote this screenplay, and I think it's the best screenplay he's written. I think he's always been a good screenwriter, at least for his dialogue. He's very good at that. He has a real ear for dialogue. Watch these feet shots. Watch here in a moment. You're going to see this woman walking right there. And we never know whose legs those belong to. Is she a casting director? Who is she? Is she someone who has gone in there and, dare I say, had sex with somebody? Has she been abused by somebody? We never get to see whose legs those legs belong to. We never see that. Who is that woman? We never get an explanation for that. And I find that interesting. Because were there female casting directors in the 1960s? Probably not. Probably not. If they were very few. Very few. And I would hazard a guess to say there were probably none, to the best of my memory, but I could be wrong about that. Someone will correct me if I am wrong. Back to the movie set of Lancer, and this, who you're going to see here, coming up, and you'll see him a lot closer in just a few moments. This is none other, and we'll see him in a moment here as we get a close-up on him. That's Luke Perry in the beige suit. Luke Perry passed away. There he is in his early 50s. He passed away in early 2019. And Luke Perry, who cuts a very sympathetic figure here as he plays this character. You know, Luke Perry was somewhat a villain, an outlaw type, a guy that was kind of rough around the edges on Beverly Hills 90210, the TV series that played, I think, in the late 1980s into the 1990s. I think that's when it really came about in the 1990s. And Luke Perry was kind of a heartthrob on that series, but he was also the guy that wronged people, wronged women to a degree. I'm not totally familiar with the 90210 series, but Luke Perry was someone who was well respected. He had a big fan club of women, and he had men who also respected him and liked him. And he was a good guy. Off screen, he was really the opposite, the antithesis of that particular character that he played on 90210. Was an all-around good guy, and his death in early 2019 was really a shock, although it had been known that he had not been well for a number of years, but it still came as a shock to people like me who never realized that he was ill. I'm not someone who, to be frank, keeps up with all of the Hollywood gossip, as it were, for lack of a better word. And I was stunned to find out that in early 2019, he passed away. I mean, I didn't see that coming at all. He was so young. You can see that DiCaprio is having a lot of fun here as this character. Rick Dalton's having a lot of fun here as Caleb Decatur, and he's been instructed by Sam Wanamaker to revel in this sexy, evil Hamlet pose, and he really goes for it. This is interesting when Julia Butters says, I love to throw myself on the floor even when I'm not getting paid to do so. And notice that Sam Wanamaker walks right past her there. He walks right past this 8-year-old girl and goes straight to Rick Dalton. That tells you about the sexism and the misogyny in Hollywood, doesn't it? Typical. That's exactly what would have happened. And I'm sure it probably still happens today. He walked right past her. It's so clear and blatant. And the irony is or the interesting thing is, at the same time, that's juxtaposed with the stunt double for Julia Butters' character meeting her. And Wanamaker just runs straight, he walks straight past Julia Butters' character. You'd think, right, that the first person you'd want to check on is the 8-year-old girl who's just been thrown to the floor, who says she has arm pads and elbow pads on, but still, you would want to check on her and go, how are you? Are you all right? But he walks straight past her. That shows you male directors, white male directors in the 1960s. And that stuff still goes on, folks. Let me tell you, there's so many stories of that going on TV series, whether it's Showtime or HBO or on films. The toxic climate against women, the misogynistic climate, these men who exact all these emotional, psychological, and physical violence measures against women who are in front of the screen and behind it in some cases. This is the truth. I mean, that is not a lie. There's some things about this film that happen that are not lies, right? That women are constantly objectified, constantly given short shrift by men, undercut by men. The misogyny is undenied, and Tarantino shows it here, but I also think he endorses it. I know he will disagree with me, and he has bristled at women who have dared to question him about misogyny in his films. Having said all of this, I think this film is superb. I wish the misogyny were not a part of it, though. But there's some complexity here. A lot of it. I love the way that Cliff Booth takes his glasses off here. It's a real 1970s moment or late 60s moment. And then he puts them back on. He's surveying this scene. This is a mini movie that we're about to see here. And all of this space. Because usually we've seen Cliff in these tight spaces. Here is a moment where we see him in a very large expanse of space that's way bigger than him. It's a Western, but it's a Western of a different kind. There's a different kind of thing going on here, a suspense. And look at the way that these women are looking at him, and the way the shots are from a distance. Spawn's movie garage, that's where they are. And here's someone running there. We're going to end up seeing who that is in a moment. And they're watching TV. I think that's Paul Revere and the Raiders who are going to come on there shortly. This is Lena Dunham. Lena Dunham, by the way, of course, of Girls and etc., has said a lot of things that I've objected to personally. Speaking of Tarantino, I'm going to say something about Lena Dunham. I mean, there's a lot of things I think that she says that are misogynistic and actually misogynoir. She says some things that I think insult black women. She discounted Aurora Perignot's account of being raped by one of Lena Dunham's friends, or at least physically assaulted by them. And rape is violence, and that she was violated by either a producer or writer on Lena Dunham's Girls series, male writer or male whatever he was on that show. Dunham actually kissed Brad Pitt at the London premiere, and it was apparently quite unwanted by Brad Pitt. So there's an assault there too. Dunham is somebody who, I don't want to spend any more time talking about it, but for all of her, I think, faux feminism, I certainly, don't respect her as much as I used to. In fact, I don't really respect her at all, but that's a whole nother story for another audio commentary. The angles here, look at these angles. The way that this is being shot, I think, is very telling. And you're going to see a repeat of these angles, type of angles that are off kilter. They once were called Dutch angles. Some think that that's offensive, and I'd rather not call them Dutch angles either, although I've mentioned that word twice now. They're just, the camera's just tilted a certain way, and it suggests something isn't quite right, or that there is a force to be reckoned with. Look at those two men in the background there. Kind of strange, aren't they? Yeah, when Cliff talks about the last cop's jaw that I ever broke, I mean, that's something that perhaps is real, that he actually did do that, not just on a set, but actually did do that, in real life to a cop. This self-confessing that goes on, albeit casually, in asides or throwaway lines. Look at all that space behind Cliff. I mean, look at that. Less space around these characters here, and then all the space there because he doesn't fill the frame like these five women do. Look at the side. It's a very interesting side angle, and we see this shot here. And then we see this shot here again. This time it's a different angle of them filling the frame. And you see a defensiveness about the woman that he has hitchhiked, that he has picked up and driven to Chatsworth. And there's a different there's a defensiveness going on. There's something going on here. And anybody who watches films and sees this kind of build-up, there's Paul Revere and the Raiders on the television there. Anyone who sees this kind of build-up, and you're going to start to see it here, and we see the tilt angle there, is usually, if you're any kind of moviegoer, you are usually conditioned to expect that something is going to happen here. And something is not only going to happen, it's going to happen to one of the lead actors in this movie. Although Brad Pitt is a supporting actor for the purposes of this film, he is a lead, obviously, at the moment, because this is a scene predicated around him. I mean, maybe that's not a satisfying explanation, but he's a supporting actor who has the screen to himself here in what is a mini movie of its own. And look at the way the women below are positioned and all the space and the angles here. You really would imagine that Cliff Booth is in over his head here. And you fully expect that something's going to happen to Cliff Booth. And it ain't going to be good. Look at the angle there, the tilt. And here again, matching. Dakota Fanning, by the way, is right there. We talked about Dakota earlier. Here she is. Wow, she's completely unrecognizable, at least to me. And she's got this, I'd say red hair, strawberry blonde. No, not strawberry, probably redhead here. These angles here, and then this shot here, which really suggests a bit of menace from Dakota Fanning's character, Squeaky. And then he puts her down. Look, Red, I'm coming in there. And there's this confident Cliff Booth who takes to belittling, as he does, women and Asian men and Mexicans. Cliff Booth is obviously a racist and a misogynist as well. Somebody who doesn't really care too much about people, although we will see in a moment that that's not necessarily all true, because he does take care of Rick Dalton very nicely, thank you very much. Look at that. Everything suggests that this guy's going to get it in the neck. And this is something that Tarantino does really well. You know, Cliff Booth is a really confident guy. And I mean, you know, he puts people down, but there's also something about him where he's somewhat endearing. He respects animals, obviously his dog, Brandy. And we're going to see in a moment what happens. But all of this build-up, this atmosphere is so suspenseful. Even that rat there wrestling around on its last legs. Everything suggests that Cliff Booth is going to get it in the neck here, meaning he's going to be killed or he's going to be attacked in some way, shape, or form. And when I first saw this movie, I was almost closing my eyes completely because I couldn't dread the suspense. There's this psychological violence that's being played on the audience. This degree of violation of expectation is so overbearing. It's overwhelming, actually. It's actually something that's more violent than any violence that could possibly happen here, because the violence is actually the release. This is like the suspense. This is equivalent to, the foreplay and the arousal stage. I hate to put that in with violence, but this is the arousal stage. The blue balls phase, for lack of a better analogy, and I know it's an awful analogy. Analogies are never really that good unless you can really pull them off. And everything is a crescendo that builds and builds. And you're writhing in suspense here at this moment. I mean, any movie that wasn't this one would have you guaranteed to think that Brad Pitt's character was going to get killed. And given Tarantino's movies, Pulp Fiction, for example, we see a major character, a major actor getting killed in that movie, out of sequence, John Travolta in Pulp Fiction, but it happens. And so we're training ourselves for that to happen to Brad Pitt. And that abates. It doesn't happen. There's a lie going on here because that's Bruce Dern. And by the way, this role by Bruce Dern, he in bed there, was supposed to be played by Burt Reynolds. Burt Reynolds died before he could participate in the filming. And so unfortunately, it didn't work out. There's a really lovely story that Tarantino tells about Burt Reynolds, who he'd always wanted to star in his films. I think there's a poster of Burt Reynolds in a film that Burt Reynolds starred in that appears in this movie early on. I think the mouth and face that we see that looks like Jack Nicholson's, I think maybe Burt Reynolds. There's a really lovely story that Tarantino tells about Burt Reynolds and his involvement with this movie, and I really wouldn't do it justice if I told it. It's something that you really have to research and find out from Tarantino if you ever hear him talk about Burt Reynolds. It's really touching and only told best by Tarantino himself. Now, Bruce Dern has said, I was fucking blind. Is he blind or was he blind? And if he is still blind, it looks as if he's looking straight at Brad Pitt, at Cliff Booth. And Bruce Dern plays George. This is an old guy, an old buddy that Cliff, I guess, worked with in stunts and worked with in movies. There's a really touching moment here. For me, from all I say about Cliff not giving two shits about most people, there's a tenderness here between these two men. And Brad Pitt really exemplifies that with this caring that he exudes as Cliff toward this old geezer that he is visiting, an old friend from years ago, from a few short years ago, only 8 years ago. And we don't know whether or not this guy is really there at his own behest or if the Manson family has kidnapped him and brainwashed him. And there's a whole lot of that because, of course, the Manson family were brainwashed by Charles Manson. That is a fact. And they were brainwashed into, of course, killing Sharon Tate. Now, that's not a spoiler alert. That's something that really happened. So I wonder if Tarantino's playing on that here. Is George, played by Bruce Dern, there on his own accord, or has he been kidnapped? And I think Cliff has made up his mind as to what he thinks about the situation. And it looks like Bruce Dern's character is looking at him directly and not playing him for being blind at all. But that gets reinforced in a way, I think, by this same character. This same hippie woman, I think, is played by Margaret Qualley. And we now see the hostility. Are we kidnapping him, she asks. He's out of there. Cliff has seen all he needs to see. This is powerful. George isn't blind. You're the blind one. That seems like something straight out of the Manson playbook. And I think it is, actually. I think I've seen some archival footage of something like that. Very powerful moment, I find. And now he's being jeered off the lot, That's his performance did not go well as far as the Manson family is concerned. And then there's real danger here because as he goes back to the car, which of course isn't even his, we see this knife. And you really think again that Cliff Booth is going to get it in the neck. Certainly Rick Dalton's car tire has got it in the neck. And there's only one person responsible for this. And look at the rocks behind him, this prehistoric scene, right? This guy looks like a Neanderthal, and he looks like he's come from those caves, these mountain caves or something behind him. It's framed perfectly by Tarantino. This feral wild guy with these wild horses behind him, with this kind of caveman look. And just because he thought he was so slick, he thought he derailed Cliff Booth, but he hasn't. It's got an extra tire. And here we see the feet, and here we see violence. It's really the first real time we see a change in plan here. And look at the Tarantino violence, boom. It's a foreshadowing of what's going to happen to somebody later on, and except it's going to be a whole lot more violent than this. This is the violent part of Cliff. That shot there, the sky looks very cloudy. I don't know if that was a cloudy day, but it certainly looks like it. And they had to try to make that look like sun. I'd love to talk to Tarantino about that. And no, you're not going to get to wipe your face. You fucked up the car. Now clean it up. And look at that moment. You're not going to get to just wipe your face here. You fix the car first. You fix the tire. Sundance. I love the way that she's addressed as Sundance, and because kind of this evocation of, the Sundance Kid, Butch Cassidy Sundance Kid, which I think was it 60, 66, 67, 68? I forget when that movie came out, but it was in the mid-1960s to late 1960s. This guy, I love the way that she rides up there. It's so reminiscent of The Searchers. By the way, The Searchers was a very demeaning film to Native Americans. My God, it was so racist against them. It was a colorful movie, John Wayne prowling around, but Native Americans were treated so awfully in the storyline of that movie. And it was just really bad. I think Natalie Wood might have been in that movie, playing a Native American. And it was, this kind of red face stuff that was going on. It was racist. Tarantino again with his Western appreciation for Westerns. And there goes Cliff. He's seen enough. He's out of there. Car tire fixed, and he's out. He's out of there. No place for old stuntmen. No country for old stuntmen. And here's Westwood, the Bruin Theater. That's in Westwood, or it's supposed to be in Westwood. And Sharon Tate has just left the theater of her own movie. And there goes Timothy Olyphant driving off over the beautiful tune by... God, again, my brain is blank here. The guy who did his rendition of California Dreaming, and Jose Feliciano, I think it is. Terrific. And there's Three in the Attic. You just saw that earlier, and now there's these marquees of the movies from that era. This excellent production design by Barbara Ling. I thought she was so good here. Love the detail. Love the detail. The Night They Raided Minsky's. That's another film from that era that was out then. You know, there was McKenna's Gold. You may have seen that as they were driving past the Columbia Pictures lot. Funny Girl with Barbara Streisand. I think that was 66 or 67 or 68. That movie. That's a movie she won the Oscar for. I think it was a tie that year with Elizabeth Taylor. Might have been for Butterfield 8 or something, or whenever that movie came out. And here's the FBI. This series came out in the late 1960s into the early 1970s, the FBI series. And again, this fantasy and reality, you're going to see Rick Dalton spliced in to this series and this fake movie poster, Jigsaw Jane, Suzanne Plachette, and Rick Dalton. That never happened. I actually looked that up. Jigsaw Jane, and of course, I found out that that movie never happened. This was all a fiction. So you've got this fantasy going on, the lie and the truth and the fantasy and the make-believe and the fiction all intertwined with some grains of truth. I love the movie posters. The production design by Barbara Ling. Excellent work, Barbara. Really. I mean, I think this is the best production design of 2019. I mean, there are other movies I could name that also had some very strong production design, but for what it was, I thought this was the very best of the lot from that year. We're going to see the splicing here of Rick Dalton into the FBI series, which again was very popular on American television in the 1960s into the early 1970s. And there we see that happen, you know. I mean, of course, Rick Dalton was never in the FBI series. This is a fantasy. It really is. And I don't know if Cliff really believes he was in the series or if he was. Maybe he was. Maybe he wanted to be. Maybe these two guys are nobodies after all. Because remember, we had Cliff Booth flashing back to a time in his career where he was wanted and then he was off the studio lot, right? So these guys may not even really be acting or doing stunts anymore. This could all be memory. This could all be flashback. This could all be two guys really at the end of careers that they're now reveling in nostalgia terms. Maybe or maybe not. Now, DiCaprio definitely, as Rick Dalton, is going through the phases of his career. But what on earth is Cliff Booth doing? You know, I mean, he's still hanging on. He's a hanger-on. He's a lifer. For sure, you know. And there's, we see Schwartz again. And he's talking about, look at this. I mean, this is Rick Dalton. This is in the opening credits for the FBI series, which, of course, Rick Dalton was never in that series. And I love how the two of them, it's like this Mystery Theater 3000, Mystery Science Theater 3000 or whatever it's called, when you have these two guys commenting on a movie that they weren't in. Or just commenting about a movie. It's funny. And then we see this title card of Friday, August the 8th. We've seen Friday, August the 9th, I think, or Saturday, August the 9th, or Sunday, August the 9th. Now we see Friday, August the 8th or 9th again. And we've seen that title card before, Another Lie. So is this the documentary again? Is this the kind of documentary that Tarantino wants us to look at? And then the narration comes in from Kurt Russell. I think it's fantastic stuff. We are being played with by these many unreliable narrators. One of them is the director himself, Tarantino. The other is obviously Rick Dalton, and to a degree, Cliff Booth as well. Maybe even Schwartz too, to a degree, perhaps. Nebraska Jim. Sergio Corbucci, who was a very famed Italian Western a film director. There's this home movie footage that I love. It's so interesting. This is a behind the scenes thing. Again, Tarantino reveling in movie making, reveling in the production of it, reveling in the behind the scenes. Now the movie posters that are completely made up for the most part. Movie posters with Rick Dalton there put into them. The only good Indian is a dead Indian now. There you go. That's part of the Hollywood. And that's what Hollywood did to the Native Americans. Really. Cast them that way. Antonio Margheriti, a film director, but also someone referenced in Inglourious Bastards. The name of a character was who looked, in fact, a bit like Antonio Margheriti, that was played by an actor. I think it was Silverman. I forget his name. John Silverman, Jonathan. I don't remember. Jonathan Schwartzman, excuse me, played Antonio Margheriti in Inglourious Bastards. Look at that. Cliff doing his stunt. This is the kind of thing, and that's part of a real movie. But this is really interesting, you know. Tarantino blending genre, or rather blending reality and fiction and fantasy and irony and contradiction. And again, this part of the movie now, this narration, now I guess it's supposed to feel like the documentary. So is this the truth? There is something fascinating about the way this part of the movie plays out. And Rick Dalton is at the front in first class, but Cliff Booth sitting at the back of the plane in coach. You know, this guy is a stuntman, but he really probably isn't that successful, probably isn't getting paid very well. Stuntmen and women did not get the respect in Hollywood, and now, these days they are. You know, now they are nominees for their own awards. Screen Actors Guild has done this, you know, has made their awards actually awards. You know, they actually get acknowledged for their work. Very dangerous work. We've had more than a few stuntmen and women die during the course of their work. I mean, it's very dangerous work. And they need to be paid even more than they are paid. And we see these two men now looking at their own obsolescence. You know, they really are obsolete. But it's interesting because I find that to be a lie too, even this split screen, because although there are white men who, yeah, they face kind of, you know, their careers are waning in some cases. There's white men who always have careers up into their 90s on the big screen, particularly in Hollywood. Right? So this seems like a lie to me. And as a black man watching this, I think, you know, that's bullshit. You know, white men are the ones whose careers go on the longest in Hollywood, behind and in front of the camera. I mean, it's women who, after 35, women of all races, whom after 35 are discarded, particularly white women, who are, you know, by the time they get to 35, that's it. They don't have a career, with some exceptions, right? The Meryl Streeps of the world and the Susan Sarandons of the world, and you know, I guess the Julianne Moores of the world, dare I say, and others who had careers beyond that time. I mean, even in previous Hollywood, Betty Davis had a career beyond 35. You know, the real greats, right? Katharine Hepburn did. You know, if you remember the greats, Joan Crawford did. You know, these are people who had careers beyond 35. You know, those individuals and others that I can think of. Olivia de Havilland. You're talking about some real greats, some legends. So there is a fiction, though, about. I mean, I get it with in the confines of this movie, but there is a big lie about that, right? About these white men somehow not being part of the Hollywood scene anymore, and you see that time stamp 12:30. So again, you're being geared up for a documentary. It feels like a documentary now, but is it really? And we see a very pregnant Sharon Tate. And you know that Sharon Tate was pregnant at the time. Roman Polanski was, I think, in London at the time these events were going on. And then we see Mike Moe and Emile Hirsch there as Jay Sebring, Mike Moe as Bruce Lee, and I think they're training. They're doing some sparring there. And look at how uber cool Brad Pitt looks. Looks like a kind of Armani getup. All white. I don't know if that is Armani he's wearing. But he looks classically cool there. He looks really cool as he does his Cliff Booth walkthrough with his dog Brandy. And then you see the production design here. The Cinerama, which is still there in Los Angeles. I think the Vine is still there. The Marquee, Musso and Frank is most certainly still there, at least at the time I am doing this audio commentary. I love the production design. Barbara Ling, you did an excellent job. I know I've said that already, but you really do it well. Look at this, the neon and all these things. And at night, the narration that Kurt Russell delivers here, I think it's intoned very well. And I think it's done nicely. And then again, the time card at 7 o'clock there. And it makes me wonder, again, is this a documentary we're watching? And we see everybody going into this restaurant. And, these are two separate stories, at least two separate stories going on. Because in this movie, Cliff Booth never gets to meet Sharon Tate. So, again, the time card, 8:32 p.m., that title. There's a separate restaurant that both Rick Dalton and Cliff Booth are going into. I think this is so funny. He makes this wisecrack about, well, how's the wife, to this guy who's married, and clearly the woman he's sitting there with is not his wife. And, that's a cynical but very clear move made there about men who cheat, who are seen around town openly cheating on their spouses. You've got Jay Sebring talking about his money, and you can see this admiration that Sharon Tate has for him. And we're hearing Kurt Russell talk about she's in this phase of her pregnancy that makes her feel a certain way, that she's almost fully to term with her child. And these two men now, it's interesting. This is August of '69, but in the beginning of the movie, we saw a similar title card with the very same date. And these two guys looked completely different, which is, again, this lie that is told throughout this movie. Leo DiCaprio's character did not have that look. His hairdo was completely different. And so, again, you've got this very unreliable narration going on throughout the movie. It's such an interesting film. Tarantino has done that. It's the very same date as he flashed up there the first time. So does that mean that the first time in 69, was that the lie, or is this the lie now? I think this is the reality now. And is that why the documentary sequence is used, or at least this attempt to make it a documentary? I don't know. I mean, I don't know what to say, but I do think it can go either way, or more than either way. It can go many ways. 11:04. There's this expectation again, something's going to happen. And this is something from a film or a TV series there. I love that TV guide, that when TV goes nude, or whatever that was, when Hollywood goes nude, whatever. And this is one of the people who, of course, was in the Tate Polanski house when all of these horrible things happened in 1969. Again, it's this time card, right? 11:46. The narrator said 11:45. This mustard-colored taxi has now returned them both to Rick Dalton's place. I mean, these two guys are drunk as skunks, right? And they've really had a good time. This guy is drunk out of his mind, and after midnight, he's making these frozen margaritas. And this guy is an alcoholic, and he has not changed. He's not changed at all. I mean, this movie is a fantasy. And I don't know whose mind it's coming from, or both of their minds. Like I said, I think these guys are a fight club in a different kind of way, right? These two sides of the same soul, and the acid trip cigarette. And you see how, Cliff here looks weathered, a little weathered. His hair's a little more tightly matted. But he looks the same in some ways. He's kept himself in good shape. But he's now undergoing this acid trip. He's getting involved with that cigarette. Ooh, is he getting involved in that cigarette? And he's on that trip now. This tune again, I think this is Paul Revere and the Raiders, and I love the vinyl. I love that we get to see that. Boom, I think that's really great. Everybody's wearing darker clothing except Sharon Tate. You'll notice that in these scenes here. Almost everybody is wearing dark clothing. Almost everyone except Sharon Tate. So you've got Cliff taking Brandy for a walk down Cielo Drive. And now, as he leaves, here comes a car that does not belong on Cielo Drive. And it looks like Christine. If you remember the movie Christine, that same kind of car with those two headlights. Christine was ruby red, was blood red. That car, Christine, was blood red. This car has this very yucky, yellowy, jaundiced, mustardy type color, banana color, that's got all this grime and oil and dirt and rust on it. It's just a car that would probably have been pulled over, quite frankly, by the LAPD at that time of night if the LAPD were anywhere near Cielo Drive. What is this beat up old car doing anywhere near this part of LA, this part of Hollywood? I mean, hey, that's the reality. That's the truth. And then there's this fascistic element again, this racist element. Goddamn fucking hippies, Rick Dalton's a racist as well, you know, and he's got something against these hippies. And he has got this jug of, what is it, margaritas that he's made in the blender, and he's carried it all the way out. I mean, he can't even bear to be without that pitcher of margarita drink, this alcohol. He is that wedded to alcohol, and alcoholics are. Now you've got these hippies who, they are clearly the Manson family. And he's drinking this margarita mix. It's incredible. And look at it, it's very clear that these folks are bad news. And you see the gun, you half expect, again, this violation of expectation. You expect that that hippie will pull that gun out and shoot Rick Dalton dead, but he does not. Or whomever is got their finger on that trigger retracts the trigger and retracts the hammer of that gun, and they retreat. Which again, if you were watching this movie in a regular setting, in a regular movie, you would have thought that that would have been the end of Leo DiCaprio's character, but it's not. Look at those two ominous red lights coming from the back of that car. Wow. Off of Cielo Drive. That looks like a really menacing car. Ooh. Oh. Very, very menacing. And it's not even red. It's not even Christine. Christine, that was some movie, some horror movie back in the day. Back in the 1980s, I think. And then you had Polanski, of course, who did Rosemary's Baby back in, what was it, 1966 or 67 or 68? I think it was 68. Not exactly 100% sure on that. But it was definitely in the late 60s. Polanski had a series of movies in the 60s. One was called Repulsion, which I think was 1966 or 67. With Catherine Deneuve. Wow, you've got to see that movie if you haven't. Done in black and white. What a powerful movie that was. Powerful horror. This scene is interesting to me because you see the Manson family and they're all talking about Rick Dalton. And, you know, someone invokes this thing about every fascist on TV in the 1950s. And these guys reminisce about when they were kids and they had a lunchbox of Bounty Law. You know, how they used to love the TV series in the 50s as kids. And you've got one of them talking about, well, look, you know, we watch this violent television, these violent movies, and these actors perpetuate this violence, and you're watching murder happen all over the place every day of the week on television, except for I Love Lucy. And now this culture that has mass marketed violence and championed it is now being confronted and indicted by this hippie family who are who have been brainwashed by Charles Manson. And now we need to exact revenge on them because they are the ones that have poisoned us, and they have contributed this fascist pro-cop violent culture. And now it's time for us to exact revenge, but they exact it on the wrong people in a way. They're exacting it on the actors. I mean, are they the right people to go to? I don't know. Or is it the system itself? Not that I'm endorsing any kind of violence, but wouldn't it be better to go, in the sake of this movie, to the Hollywood guys like the Marvin Schwartz character or someone else who perpetuates this stuff, who glorifies it, who architects it? The answer to that question may not be as simple as you may think. And there's a lie. Another lie is that the woman who was with them wanted to get something. She forgot her knife, but she didn't forget her knife. She wanted to get out of there. So she drives off and leaves. And now it's just the three of them. Another lie that's told. Another lie that happens. You think she's going to go get her knife, but no, she drives off. And of course, Cliff is back with Brandy. You know, there was a song back in the early 70s called Brandy, You're a Fine Girl. It's written and sung by Looking Glass. Great song. It actually was also in the film Black Klansman, directed by Spike Lee. And I wonder if there's something else going on with the dog being called Brandy. You know, interesting. A fine girl? Is that the fine girl? This cute dog that looks like a pit bull? Here's the acid trip taking full effect and full hold of Cliff Booth. He has been found out. That acid cigarette really did work. And he only had to pay 50 cents for it. Imagine that. I don't know. How much would you pay for an acid laced cigarette now? I don't know. I have no idea. And I'm not someone who trips on acid, so I'm not the one to go to get an answer from on that. Consult your local internet or something, I think. We're seeing a confluence of things now. Good food for mean dogs. You know, I think that those labels were invented by Tarantino. I think he completely invents these dog foods, wolf's tooth, rat flavor, and this flavor and that flavor, and we've seen it rat already in this movie. But I think these are wholly made up dog foods. I don't think that really existed. I think Tarantino designed that stuff too. It was all I think fiction, although I could be completely wrong. There's truth in advertising, but there's lies in advertising. Ooh, yeah, suddenly that dog food doesn't look the same to Cliff Booth. But there's truth and lies in advertising, and advertising has been all over this movie too. And advertising is a lie, right? It's a sales pitch. You get these burgers at Burger King, and they never look like they look in the commercial, right? Not to plug a particular brand of fast food, but I guess I just thought of that one. There are other ones I don't want to mention. You know who they are. And they look really good, right? On the television, ooh, they're succulent and juicy. And then you go to these actual fast food places, and the burger's all squashed, and it's flat, and it's not rich or robust at all. It's a complete lie. And there's a lot of commercialism running throughout this film. You're always being sold something, and it's quite oppressive, actually. Not impressive, oppressive. And you've got one of the hippies from the Manson family taking the back entrance. What I also find interesting is that women are a very big part of this last portion of the movie, where they haven't been for almost all the movie. And some of it is not for very positive reasons at all, and quite misogynistic ones, quite frankly. You'll see, and I'll try to talk about it in these next few minutes. This tune is Vanilla Fudge's tune. It's called You Keep Me Hanging On. It's a rendition of the song that was done by others, have been done by others. I think by Diana Ross and the Supremes, actually, were the originators of it, or Martha and the Vandellas, I think, may have been. And you've got Vanilla Fudge doing it. This is Quentin Tarantino's edit, and it really works for his film. I love this part by Pitt. He's just totally acid out. He's just tripped out on acid here. And I love how he plays the role as Cliff, tripped out on acid with a guy pointing a gun at him. And of course, he will soon recognize who these individuals are. This is so funny, but yet it's gonna get very violent. And for those of you who have seen this film, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you haven't seen this film, well, I've just spoiled it for you, haven't I? You should have seen this movie before you listen to anything I say here. I love this. You know, where the old movie device where the men laugh at each other just before, or at the point of violence, right? How comical it all is. And one of them points a gun at them, and the other one points his finger. So you know he's absolutely tripped out on acid. Way tripped out. He's drugged out. He's addled out. He's done. I'm as real as a fucking donut. In other words, it's this kind of jab at cops, the stereotype of cops eating donuts. I mean, is that even true anymore about the police? I mean, I know what is still true of police is that they beat up and shoot and kill unarmed black people. That is definitely true. That's not changed at all, sadly. Black lives still do matter. But is it true, by the way, on another much more trivial note, I would say, is it true that police still eat donuts? I mean, I don't know if that's even really true anymore. I'm sure it's true in some areas. Yeah, I recognize you guys. Yeah, you're from the Spawn Movie Ranch. Yeah. But this guy is now full-blown Manson family cult member, and here comes the violence. And it goes on for the next 5 or 6 minutes, and it's going to be really graphic. Boom. And this woman is going to scream and scream, and this dog is going to bite and bite, and it's a female dog. Son of a bitch. I think that's very interesting because bitch is what is, the derogatory term used to call women that name, right? And a bitch is known as a female dog. And now you're seeing that female dog really have a go at this male killer, would-be killer. And Brandy, you're a fine girl, has turned into Brandy, you are a killer. And so here we go with the knife and an acided out Cliff Booth still can spar with the best of them. And we know how violent Cliff can be because we saw that earlier at Spawn Ranch, and now we're seeing it again here in full effect. Boom. And we've got a woman here with a knife and another woman here who is being attacked violently by Brandy. And now this woman has just plunged a knife into Cliff. Whoa. And now he looks down and realizes what's happened. This is about to get very violent here. And even with acid, this thing still hurts. And you can tell, wow, he's going to just absolutely unload violently on this woman. This is so difficult to watch. Oh my God. I mean, this is, now you can see that he really did kill his wife, didn't he? I mean, this is so hard to watch. Good grief. Tarantino unloading here. This misogynistic frenzy, this violence against women by this man that is so bad. And by the way, I think Cliff gets shot here, or he faints from this knife attack. And meanwhile, you've got Rick Dalton, who's practicing his lines, has now been rudely interrupted by some woman who is now screaming her lungs off, has been for literally all of the last 3 or 4 minutes. Something Tarantino loves to highlight, these extra pitches for these women. I've never known a woman to really scream that long. But Tarantino does that. That's part of what I think is the misogyny, right? This quote unquote hysterical woman, that term hysteria is very much rooted in a lot of sexism and misogyny. And it was a term that was used back in the 1920s and 30s by a lot of men, a lot of quote unquote male scientists male doctors who would say this about women. They're hysterical. And that would root something deeply within the body too. Hysterectomies and, this hysteria. That was very sexist and very misogynistic. And now you've got the doubling, right? This is the doubling sequence. This time it's the enemy, right? It's Rick Dalton doing this to a woman now. And the woman, this is kind of like a Joan of Arc moment, right? A woman being burnt at the stake, really, in a swimming pool in Hollywood in 1969. So nothing's really changed. This male violence against women. Earlier, it was male violence against the Nazis, and now it's this male violence against a woman. That doubling, right? That's that doubling thing. And now there's a knife, and now there's the burnt to a crisp woman in the pool of the house of Rick Dalton. Cielo Drive has been rocked, and it really has been rocked. And the violence was coming in this Tarantino film. And you've got these police. For the first time we really see the police, right, properly. Right? They are coming in here as if it's the end of a movie procedural in a TV movie or in a TV series like Beretta or Mannix or any one of those TV series that came around, the streets of San Francisco that would come up in the 1970s, Carl Malden and Michael Douglas. I remember that one so well. And this is the way that these kinds of TV series would finish, where you've got people, Columbo or whomever, and you've got these people talking about, well, what happened, and they're talking to the police, some devil shit, and they're all inventory. These police are inventorying the situation, and you've got these individuals telling these stories, some in different languages. And this is like the quintessential buddy TV movie that ends the way it does. Look, Cliff is being hauled off to hospital. And you've got DiCaprio, as Rick Dalton, who's, wanting to make sure that the guy who's been covering him for a long time in Hollywood is going to be okay. And, Rick Dalton's looking at Cliff here, and Cliff is saying, look, I'm going to be fine. Just look after my dog, please, Brandy. I love this shot here because we see the camera stays with Cliff Booth all the way through, even as he disappears. I don't know if it's a process shot or a visual effect, but we get to see it, right? This is really great. This shot here from Richardson is genius here. And we never, look at that. It's either a shot that's out of focus or it's a process digitized shot. And we never really, look at that. We see it all the way through until it disappears. Really good stuff there. And those cop cars disappear, and then it looks like a dissolution into a different kind of reality now. As we see the character all alone here is Rick Dalton until, boom, we see a gated community. Jay Sebring. It's like these two things meeting. One of them true, one of them not, right? This gated community, this kind of jail cell. On the other side of that is a complete fantasy, Rick Dalton. This is the reality here, Jay Sebring. And in front of that is the fantasy here, Rick Dalton. And these two variables are meeting. However uneasily at a distance, they are coalescing, or at least trying to. And this kind of gate in front of Jake Sebring, yes, it's the gated community, but it's also this jail cell of the reality that happens to Jay Sebring and to the other people in the Tate Pulaski household. It's an uneasy marriage of fiction and reality. And lies, right? Is everybody okay? That's an ironic line coming from Jay Sebring, because we know what happened to Jay Sebring in 1969. Then you hear the voice of Sharon Tate. but some hippies broke into the house next door. Well, you know, and look at this. He turns around here, DiCaprio, and I think he's nodding to a larger truth there about Sharon Tate and about Jay Sebring and what really, goes on, what really happens. I think in that moment, there's this glimpse of that, you know? And Sharon Tate's inviting Rick Dalton into the house. And I love that. Thumbs up from Jay Sebring. That was very popular back in the 60s and 70s. That kind of thing you'd see on TV, at least, where the hero or somebody would just do that thumbs up sign as to say, yeah, I'm with you. You're cool, man. It's okay. I think you would see that in the Batman and Robin TV series. Robin might flash that sign, or someone would do so. That thumbs up, and they have that look on their face of, yeah, you're all right, man, kind of thing. And now Rick Dalton has crossed the Rubicon, crossed into this. He's kind of spliced himself in. Tarantino has spliced Rick Dalton into a reality now, as he did with the FBI program, as he did with The Great Escape, as he did with numerous other things. He's spliced Rick Dalton into a reality. The lie becomes the truth. And now we crane up, Robert Richardson's camera does, and we see Sharon Tate. She welcomes Rick Dalton into this world. And then there are the other two people. Now, there are four people in that scene who, in reality, do not make it out alive. I mean, they just do not. I mean, the reality is that those four people were murdered by hippies, the Manson family, who were brainwashed by Charles Manson to actually go out and kill. And they targeted Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski. Now, Polanski, as I said, was in Europe making a movie at the time. And look at that. Look at that. And I like the mix of title there. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, we see the lie. Again, the Hollywood ending. The one that really doesn't happen in reality, right? Because we know that Sharon Tate was brutally murdered. And you can find out just how if you're not familiar, because I don't want to really talk about how brutal that was. It was such a violation of her, a violation of everybody in that moment, of Jay Sebring and the two other people that you saw there. Fred Raskin's editing, Ariana Phillips with the costumes, and Barbara Ling's production design and the visual effects, John Dykstra. And we see on and on the credits here. And that music that gets played. I believe it was Maurice Jarre's music from Miss Lily Langtry, a theme there from an old, I think, TV series or a movie. And it's so sad. Because at one point, Tarantino's been very respectful to Sharon Tate in that moment, but he also, but on the other hand, he hasn't given her a lot of dialogue. But at the same time, the complexity of it is that we don't really want to see Sharon Tate be murdered on screen. And maybe the Tarantino of the Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction days would have shown us that brutal murder of Sharon Tate. And everything is leading to that, because we see this time card over and over again. We see, February the 9th, 1969. And we're led to believe that this is a documentary that's going to result in us watching this brutal murder. But instead, we get to see the brutal murder of at least three other people, all hippies. The very hippies who did go in and kill Sharon Tate. So there's this irony, this complete lie, this fantasy that never happened in reality. And what really happened is the truth we don't get to ever see. And thank God for that, I guess. We're being protected. Hollywood has protected us in a lot of very destructive ways. These lies about black people being, evil, Native Americans being savages. These are all lies, and Hollywood has told these lies for centuries, told these lies about women as well, put them in a certain way. And now you've got the lie of advertising here during these closing credits, where you've got Jake Cahill, played by Rick Dalton, advertising these Red Apple cigarettes, right? Advertising is a lie. I've talked about that earlier. This truth in advertising thing is a lie to a large degree. And you're going to see that in a moment. And here, Jake Cahill, who's played by Rick Dalton, played by DiCaprio, kind of comes across as a Ronald Reagan 1950s General Electric Theater pitchman, which is what Reagan was. And he did B movies, of course. And of course, became the president of the Screen Actors Guild and became the governor of California, and then became the president of the United States of America. And look what he did to the country. My goodness, he tanked it. And that's before a certain someone in the White House who got impeached also tanked it. And now look, once the camera is off, he destroys that cardboard cutout. He hates Red Apple cigarettes. That's the truth, right? And the idea is that everybody who advertises something, just because they advertise it doesn't mean they even like the product or even use the product, And again, that's the lie of advertising. I used to think as a kid that everybody who advertised a product actually did either eat it or like it or endorsed it or approved of it. And they really didn't approve of these products, or they really didn't like them. Most of these people just did it for a quick buck, and they still do. It doesn't mean they use the product at all. You've got this Batman promo here that really did happen on KHJ radio with Don Steele and all that great stuff in the 1960s. What a great movie this was. It is such a brilliant movie. And I'm not even a fan of Tarantino, but I'm a big fan of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Thank you very much for listening to my audio commentary. I'm Omar Moore. You can catch me on Twitter at The Popcorn Reel. Popcorn, The Popcorn, REEL. Thank you.